Thank you all for joining and welcome to RMI's webinar, Advanced Industrial Zones to Bolster Regional Economic Development. My name is Ali Job. I'm an associate here at RMI on our economic development team. For those of you who don't know, RMI is an independent, nonpartisan research and advisory nonprofit. We're focused on energy systems transformation. We were founded in 1982 and are Colorado-based. We have since grown to an organization of about 600 folks, and we're active in over 50 countries. Just to do a little bit of housekeeping and acknowledgements, we want to acknowledge the new Energy Industrial Strategy Center, or the NIS Center, for supporting this work and this session of webinars. This session is being recorded, and as we've dropped in the chat, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. We've reserved about 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So I work on the economic development team at RMI, and our team focuses on opportunities for regional economic development through new energy projects, both helping places, including the manufacturing and attraction of those projects, as well as deployment of new energy technology. Specifically, we help places understand what piece of the new energy opportunity that they are able to capture in their region. This webinar is part of a no-cost webinar series we've been hosting. We also have in-person programming, including an upcoming boot camp in Boulder next week, which I think we have like 1 or 2 spots left for as well. So wanted to put that there as well. So for our agenda today, we'll run through some context and introductions. Jake Higdon from Advanced Industrial Zones will give a presentation. We'll also have a moderated panel on site readiness. My colleague Erin Brickman will be moderating that with a couple of experts who work in site readiness in their regions. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for audience Q&A and open it up to your questions. So today we're talking about site readiness for electro-industrial technologies and other advanced manufacturing. And when I say electro-industrial, what I mean is technologies ranging from EV batteries to grid equipment to semiconductors, a lot of advanced manufacturing industries that represent huge economic opportunities for regions. The reason that we at RMI are focused on this sector is because the opportunity is enormous. We see from this graph, Census Bureau data shows strong construction investment trends in these sectors from 2020 to 2025. But in the last few years, we've also seen that federal support for some of these industries is unstable. So states and regions really have to identify the levers within their control to influence where these investments land. What we find over and over in our engagement with economic developers in states and regions is that some difficulties arise in attracting these industries from a lack of ready sites to host these investments. And that's not because there's a lack of space to host these projects, but these industries can have huge energy and space requirements, require larger campuses, water infrastructure. All of that's very difficult to have ready to go for an anchor tenant that wants to come in. This map here shows that states have been responding by setting up what are called site readiness funds to help do some of that pre-development work and attract this investment. So all of these programs that are highlighted here, they're non-exhaustive, but they follow different models and they fund different work. So we're excited to dig in a bit today on what good industrial planning can look like in order to attract big ticket new energy projects. Who you'll hear from today, or you'll hear from a range of panelists who bring different perspectives to this work. I'm joined by my colleague, Erin Brickman, who's the senior principal and leads our economic development team. Jake Higdon, who will present on advanced industrial zones, and you'll hear from him next. And for our moderated panel, Amanda Taylor from Greater MSP Partnership and Richard Varga from the Site Readiness for Good Jobs Fund over in Cleveland will discuss how their regions are thinking about site readiness. So with that, I will pass it over to Jake.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali. Thanks to you and Erin and RMI for the opportunity to present today. As Ali said, I'm Jake Higdon. I'm the founder of Advanced Industrial Zones, which is a policy initiative. But Advanced Industrial Zones is also the name of the policy. So I'll be talking a little bit about what I mean by that and sort of how it fits into and augments the broader sort of site readiness and industrial policy playbook. And really excited to hear from Rick and Amanda as well on their experience in different parts of the country on site readiness. So with that, going to go ahead and dive in. Just quick agenda on my end. So I'll talk about the case for an updated site readiness and place-based industrial policy toolkit in this particular moment. This moment being that electro-industrial investment boom that Ali was talking about. I'll share a bit more about advanced industrial zones as a framework. I might say AIZ throughout the presentation to shorthand it, which I think is one tool for managing this era, potentially among others. And then I'll touch on some best practices in terms of governance and some lessons learned from different case studies around the country and internationally. And depending on time, I might say a word on data centers, but that's a meaty topic, so we'll see if we have time to get into it. So Ali already kind of gave some great context on the opportunity, but just to add a little bit more color from my perspective, over the past several years, we've seen sort of a series of different waves over different timelines crest essentially at the same time into this set of investments in advanced manufacturing and energy, electronics, and digital infrastructure. And these offer huge investment and economic development opportunities for regions across the country, in large part because they, shift the emphasis back on the physical currency of land and power infrastructure and a skilled manufacturing workforce. These localized advantages that, at least for many regions, have somewhat fallen out of favor in the software era. But despite this unprecedented investment, I think there's a relatively broad consensus that in the US, we're struggling to build the industries of the future. There have no doubt been major upswings in investment, some huge notable success stories, but there have also been a number of recent factory cancellations. There have been stalled clean energy projects. There's the data center backlash that we're seeing around the country. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that these next generation industries require the same set of place-based inputs: land, infrastructure, water infrastructure, power infrastructure, clear permitting processes and sort of local administrative procedures, and a skilled workforce. And so the investment boom is putting a big strain on this set of place-based inputs that have not necessarily been the focus over the past few decades as we kind of adapted to an era of relatively slow load growth and deindustrialization. To channel this, wave of investment in next generation industries into positive sum economic development opportunities for communities and for regions across the country, I think that's the task of this era, figuring out what that positive sum model is. But officials, economic development practitioners, they can only do that if they know what industries they want to see, where they want to see them, and what their constituents are going to be able to support. So from my view, we need an updated industrial policy and governance model that's prepared to bring together environmental groups, workers, communities, manufacturers, all around that vision, and to proactively plan for that set of electro-industrial investments. So that's what I'm hoping to build and articulate with the advanced industrial zone model. So preamble aside, what do I mean by an advanced industrial zone? There's no one specific definition. It's not, a statutory thing codified in law, like, at the federal level, there's a statutory definition for federal opportunity zones. I think instead, think of it as a framework for kind of a category of policy tools that could be adapted to a number of different contexts at the state or community level. But that's very vague. So to put some more specifics behind it, I define an advanced industrial zone as a designated geography, something you can actually draw on a map, that states and communities are co-developing to attract, retain, support the new electro-industrial sector in a thoughtful and managed and proactive way. So states and communities work together to identify key geographies, to identify target sectors, to set guardrails around those sectors and how they can set up shop in that geography. And then because the whole purpose of a zone-based approach is to have some sort of special enabling conditions within that zone to align state and community resources to addressing those place-based barriers that I mentioned before, the shared physical, regulatory, infrastructural challenges that we need to overcome to build out the electro-industrial economy. And I think of this largely in terms of 5 Ps. I feel like acronyms with Ps come up a lot in economic development world, but for me, it's property, power infrastructure, permitting, people, both on the community and sort of workforce side, and then a proactive state partner to pull this all together. And if you can build an industrial ecosystem, if you can build an industrial zone that aligns those things, gets those right ingredients in the right place, then you can capture the opportunity of the electro-industrial era in a way that communities can support that delivers durable economic development benefits. So that sort of brings me to why do you need a zone-based approach? Zones are definitely not new in the economic development world. They're behind many of the most sort of successful growth stories internationally over the past half century. Various types of economic zones in East Asia, various types of eco-industrial parks in places like Denmark, Sweden, South Korea. In the US, though, at least at the federal level, zones are often associated with tax breaks or regulatory changes. You think about sort of opportunity zones or enterprise zones. And I think the focus on zones here, for me, is on the power of a zone to, again, align that set of inputs, that set of conditions that all electro-industrial applications need. So a few ways I think the zone approach kind of meets the moment. One, it can position states as infrastructure coordination partners, not just check writers. So that's not to say there's not a role for states in writing checks or offering cash incentives. But again, the power of the zone is in that geographic and that place-based planning. How do you get the infrastructure, the land, the site readiness all together? Two, they can enable speed and experimentation, basically creating geographic sandboxes where you do things a little bit differently. You try to break down barriers, and you can kind of align a set of procedures, a set of policy tools, and target them in a specific place in an attempt to speed up the development of these sectors. Three, even while attempting to speed up development, you can facilitate meaningful and proactive community-led planning. Rather than sort of the typical model, which is maybe a project is announced, and then there's a series of community meetings or kind of reactive discussions about what that project means for the community. The zones offer an opportunity for a community and a state to think about what are the industries we want to see here, what are the guardrails we want to put around them, and how do we want to kind of support that ecosystem as it grows. Number four, zones can help support place-based clusters and agglomeration effects that you get when you get supply chains, workforce, innovation ecosystems all in one place. And finally, you can think of them as kind of paving the runway for future investment. So for instance, my background's in federal energy and climate policy. We've seen big 180 swings at the federal level that has kind of been start and stop in terms of federal investment. And many projects haven't gotten built out by the time the policy reverses. You can sort of imagine these zones as a way to prep the ground and prep a landing pad for future investments so that it can go further faster. It's important to look around to interesting examples of zones. And I think folks often look overseas. That's certainly seems to be the case right now in US federal policy discussions. I think this is largely prompted by the semiconductor um, investment boom coming out of the CHIPS Act, where policymakers, communities are talking about the challenges building fabs in the US and looking to models in places like Taiwan, where there are specialized zones for the build out of these facilities with streamlined permitting processes and other procedures in place to make that happen more expeditiously. But I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't also look around at a ton of state and local work in this area that is well underway and offers great lessons for us. One that I always talk about, and if there are folks in the audience who have talked to me about AIZs before, you've probably heard me harp on this, but Devens, Massachusetts created the Devens Regional Enterprise Zone to deal with the fallout of the Fort Devens Army Base closure in the 90s. And they essentially, again, drew a zone on a map where the Army base was and set up an independent entity, the Devens Enterprise Commission, to administer that enterprise zone. And that entity really does two big things. One, it manages the planning and development process for the zone. So they run and oversee the Devens Reuse Plan, which includes a focus on eco-industrial development. So both sustainability and advanced manufacturing being priorities for the land use within that zone. But then second, and this is really the calling card, they run a 75-day unified permitting process for all permits necessary to set up a manufacturing facility within that zone. And the results somewhat speak for themselves. They've been able to more than replace all the jobs that were lost at the Army base, which was initially 7,000. So they've exceeded that. And they'll soon be over 8,000 with the recent announcement of an expanded advanced metals manufacturing facility within the zone. $8 billion in annual output and a six-figure average annual salary for folks in the zone. So this sort of leads me to the last piece that I wanted to talk about on advanced industrial zones, which is just zone designation and governance. What are the best practices that we've learned from the past year of looking at these case studies and engaging with stakeholders around the country? So the first big kind of best practice is that zones should really be community-led and state-enabled. I think it's really important that the state does lean in. This is industrial policy. After all, communities often don't have the resources to fully develop these zones, or they don't have the authorities, the legal authorities to do things like do a massive power infrastructure build out because of their kind of jurisdictional ability to influence utility planning and things of that nature. So the state needs to lead in. And the state should establish a process for nominating and designating zones. Maybe they want one, maybe they want several, and they want to go through a nomination process. But once those initial kind of nominations come through, the community should really take the lead. And this is where I think EDOs can play a really important role, identifying assets and land use, identifying target sectors that are suitable for the zone, and then setting expectations for community and worker benefits. Again, using that zone designation process as a tool to bring stakeholders to the table and to think proactively about the type of development that you want to see. But then ultimately, where the rubber meets the road is in terms of the enabling toolkit. So the 5 Ps. It's not enough to just, draw the zone on a map and be like, use that as a narrative tool to tell the story. You have to actually make it easier to develop these industries in the right way in these zones. And so this is a mix of, state and local tools like might be state site prep funding that is then implemented by the community. It might be infrastructure financing, like a state revolving loan fund for infrastructure build out, or local tax increment financing. And this is also where the power access piece comes into play. So does a state require the utility to proactively plan for and build power capacity to serve these zones, even before all of the manufacturing loads are online within the zone? And then the second big category in terms of best practices, and I'm running up on time, so I'll wrap up here in a second, is that ultimately after this initial planning process, the zones need to be relatively operationally independent to be able to move with the speed and iterative nature necessary to develop these sites. You see this often in overseas models of zones, that there's typically a designated independent authority. It could be for a specific zone, or it could be for all of the zones within a jurisdiction that's endowed with a certain set of delegated tools, whether that is infrastructure financing tools or the ability to oversee all of the permits in that zone. They should be the ones implementing it based off of that initial kind of community and state planning process. And there should also be a relatively long timeline, 10, 15 years, something on that order, to allow for the iterative process and the long-term infrastructure planning necessary in the zone. So with that, I'll skip over the data center piece, which, as mentioned, I thought I might not have time for today, but happy to chat offline if folks are interested. And then just to close out, I wanted to just emphasize advanced industrial zones are a framework that's built on long-standing economic development tools. I think of them as sort of part site readiness, part shared infrastructure, part community governance. And I think that they can enable and supercharge the many great site readiness efforts already underway in communities and states around the country, but are potentially, an update or a reframe that allows communities to meet the opportunity of the electro-industrial moment, but also manage it in a way that actually delivers durable and diversified economic benefits. So with that, thanks for the time, and look forward to the conversation with Amanda and Rick. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jake. That was great. As we transition to Amanda and Rick, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and just ask you one question that's just on my mind. The time scale for Devons, you mentioned that it was part of BRAC, the base closure in the 90s. Did they get started immediately? And has that 8,000 or so job growth been from in that sort of 30-year period? Oh, we lost. Did we lose Jake? Jake, did you hear my question?
I am back. My Zoom just crashed and then immediately reopened. I heard the first half of the question.
Yeah, just wondering about the time scale for Devons, if it's been like just 30 years that this is happening, or if it, these just thinking about their tenants, investors, and job growth.
Yeah, my understanding is that essentially the planning process for Devon started, in the 90s. I think there might have been legislation a little bit later to sort of set up the Enterprise Commission, potentially in the aughts, but it was a multi-decade process.
Thanks. All right. I have other things on my mind, but we'll get to it a little bit later in audience Q&A, particularly if the audience doesn't have any Qs for your As. But now let's get to our implementation experts, Amanda and Rick. We'll start with you, Amanda, going alphabetically. But I want to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves and to hear about how your organization is thinking about this topic of site readiness.
Thank you, Aaron. And Jake, thank you for a great overview. I know we'll be showing a lot of parallels between what we're experiencing in the field and what you're presenting here. So thank you. So I'm Amanda Taylor. I am with a regional economic development organization for the Minneapolis-St. Paul region of Minnesota, Greater MSP. I lead our business investment team. So we are the team out doing global promotion of Minneapolis-St. Paul, generating opportunities for business growth here in the region through expansion, attraction, and retention. I've got a great team that is out every day working with companies who are making competitive location decisions, and that often involves identifying sites that work for them. And so I live and breathe the competitive landscape of landing these projects and having, the best mix of sites, workforce, operating environment for the industries that we're trying to grow here. And then what I would certainly draw on as we talk more on this webinar is my prior job, which was almost a decade with McCallum Sweeney Consulting. I was a site selection consultant. McCallum Sweeney was one of the early players in site certification, so I had the opportunity to work with communities across the country on site readiness strategies. So I'll be looking forward to sharing more about that.
And I'm Rick Barga. I am with a newly created organization in Cleveland, Ohio called the Site Readiness for Good Jobs Fund. We are essentially a extension of the city's economic development office, although we sit in a separate organization. I am a former community organizer turned real estate developer on the public side. So I have been looking at brownfield redevelopment in Cleveland, affordable housing in New York City, a number of different places where I've lived, just been in the details of the pro forma and really now into land assembly and cleanup in Cleveland. So excited to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Amanda. So Amanda, you've worked in site readiness, as you said just a moment ago, and site certification in different capacities, and you've witnessed a sort of evolution of this concept over time. Can you speak to that evolution, what's changed, and what the new model for site readiness looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I shared with the team on this webinar in our preparation, you can consider me the nerding out on site readiness. I love this topic. I think it's so important. It was such a transformation in how we do economic development in America. I mean, it was the early 2000s when this concept really first came up as a more formalized approach to how communities can work together to prepare for projects in advance to increase their competitiveness. And as a site selection consultant, this came out of the site selection consulting world because the consultants were noticing some communities were better prepared than others. Some communities were making the investments, deciding what they wanted, speculatively preparing land, primarily through public sector decision making, public sector investment to drive their competitiveness to win projects. And I think the learning was, wow, what if we really standardized this? What if it wasn't just a back room negotiation or a decision that was happening, behind closed doors, but really brought more visibility and structure to how communities could prepare for projects. And so, the whole idea from the beginning was speed to market. So streamlining and making a faster pathway for a company to be operational, because as always goes with these projects, and it doesn't matter if this was 20 years ago or today, the timeline that companies expect to be operating when they start site selection is always shorter than the timeline that it is really conceivable that will take. Now, of course, things have gotten really out of hand these days as lead times on certain utility infrastructure has expanded. So we were building site certification when the focus was really about de-risk, do your due diligence up front, identify how are you going to get utilities to the site? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? And having confirmation that if that infrastructure wasn't already at the site, that you had a plan to get it there and that you could prove that you could get it there. That was the difference, that the community had made the decision in advance to invest in this due diligence in advance for the kinds of projects that they wanted to win. So when Jake makes the point about community coming together and deciding what it wants, this is what certification and site readiness programs have been about from the very beginning. Now, what has changed? I would say the big thing I've noticed, and I think probably many economic developers around the country are noticing, one, the speed to market has intensified. We're competing not only against each other, but now everything is a bit of a global competitiveness, right? So we're talking about these industries that are critical to economic security, national security. We're in a race to win, certainly in the semiconductor, AI infrastructure space, so that pressure on speed is increased. At the same time, that utility capabilities and constraints are really at their limits, right? So we're watching as power demand and power availability are just really up against each other. And the demand for power has increased. So back when we were doing mega site readiness, so these were 1,000-acre sites, when a community was trying to attract, an automotive OEM assembly plant, which were like the biggest kinds of projects you could do, a site certification would require them to prepare for about a 30-megawatt demand. A 30-megawatt demand for an auto assembly plant. And now think about where we are these days with these semiconductor projects. Of course, data center is really off the charts. So the utility demands are increasing. And then finally, I think the thing that's changed a lot is just the local funding mechanisms, the public funding mechanisms to support these investments. We're just seeing local budgets being tighter and tighter, which makes these kinds of pre-development steps harder and harder. But super important, and I know we're going to be learning a whole lot about what's going on in Cleveland now and a little bit about how we're looking at this in Minnesota. But long-standing approach to doing this, but does require in this moment new thinking on how to actually be prepared.
That's for sure. Thanks, Amanda. So, Rick, your organization's model seems distinct and may be a good example of this new model that Amanda's describing. Can you talk through how the fund came to be and why Cleveland saw this fund as the solution?
Yeah, thanks so much. I couldn't agree more with what Amanda said. As she was describing the proactive steps that communities need to take, it's straight out of the playbook that what we are looking at here. A city that was built 200 years ago, founded on industrial legacy, all riddled throughout our communities, that had been disinvested already with post-industrial era, brownfields, abandoned sites everywhere. The city of Cleveland took a very proactive step with a new mayor and Justin Bibb to create this new site readiness fund that would partner with the county land bank, which has special statutory powers to hold remediated land, and also with our largest foundation, the Cleveland Foundation, to endow a fund that will live forever to help us assemble land and clean brownfield sites. Now, there are many reasons why we wanted to do this. First and foremost, we are trying to create good jobs for our residents. And to be in this attraction game, as Amanda is talking about, we needed to have sites. We needed to have sites that were available for businesses and developers to look at. And when this mayor took office in 2021, there was one site greater than 10 acres that was ready to go. Now, there are 4,000 disinvested industrial acres across the city of Cleveland that are all scattered in the wind. I've spent the last 3 years assembling almost 400 of those acres with a goal to get to 1,000, and packaging them, cleaning them, assessing them and cleaning them and looking for funding and trying to bring in developers to meet at the same time a moment in United States history and in the market, in the industrial markets history, where we know that due to COVID, supply chains were broken, economic security is paramount to our national interests, and there are billions and trillions of dollars being reinvested back in this country. And so Cleveland is trying to meet that moment from the business side, from the environmental justice side of cleaning brownfields, and on a job creation play for our residents. So I know a lot of people want to talk about data centers and want to think about what could be possible. What we are targeting in our sites is very niche manufacturing sectors like food production and different types of defense industries that will have production related jobs that our residents can attain. And so the whole play sort of stems from partnerships that allow us to be proactive, and then putting these sites in a position to win deals.
Rick, I'm interested in a little bit more about the partnerships aspect. Curious to learn about how the fund is empowered, how closely you're coordinating with the city and maybe private sector to redevelop sites. Basically, how do you decide priority sites for investment, and who are you working with to do so?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a number of different levers that help me be proactive in this field. So for one, just holding title to contaminated land is very risky. And there's reasons that the private market doesn't step in and do this work, because it costs money, it costs time, and it's a lot of headache from the entitlement side. And so because we are an extension of the city, we already have these deep relationships with our city government to help us think about the bureaucratic process on the side of thinking about redevelopment. The county land bank, like I said, has these special statutory powers to hold land tax-free, to receive contaminated land and provide some type of level of liability protection from the state of Ohio and the Ohio EPA from coming after the land bank. And so it is because of those unique relationships that we are able to be forward thinking. Like, we are sending letters to businesses saying, long defunct businesses, Shell LLCs, who are still holding land, and saying, we're coming on your property. The Site Readiness Fund is an extension of the city, and we're going to do environmental testing to find out the contamination that is there. And so that's a pretty bold move for a city to be taking with regard to private landowners. And I'm very, very proud that when they don't answer, I show up with bolt cutters and big, thick construction boots, and I bring a team of environmental professionals, and we go into sites. The county land bank also has special powers to work through the forfeiture process, which allows us to get at different types of properties where we can take title and assemble property, because we can't just clean a 1 acre site and expect a company to come. We are trying to build large 10 to 30 to 50 acre sites. And because of a 200-year history, we really have to think about all of the different parcels and all the different tools in the toolbox to be able to assemble all of that land together. The other really unique relationship that we leverage is with Ohio EPA and the Ohio Department of Development. We have been very fortunate to be able to access a lot of state brownfield funding, whether it's from an assessment or a cleanup or a demolition perspective. These different pots of money, by utilizing the county land bank, their staff, their GIS staff, their administrative staff, their legal staff, to be able to put forward solutions to how to redevelop these sites is one of what we think our competitive advantages are. In terms of redevelopment, we put out RFPs. We look for development partners. We just announced a major master plan called the Midline Project, which is a 350-acre business park where we are looking at an alternative energy district to coincide with. There are a lot of different ways that we are trying to think about how to redevelop sites in conjunction with community, thinking about minority participation in businesses in these urban areas, and how we can design urban spaces, parks, and trails alongside them. So all of that sort of runs in different verticals, but we are running full steam ahead at all of them.
Well, very evocative. Thinking about you with bolt cutters and boots and maybe a hard hat. Thanks for that. Amanda, and as the questions are rolling in, I think your response to this one will help preempt a couple of those. To my knowledge, Minnesota does not have a dedicated statewide site readiness fund. So in the absence of that, how is Greater MSP working on its site strategy? And what would you say to other regions that may not have funds at their disposal to fund site upgrades?
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, we're at it, right? So it's true. Minnesota does not have a site readiness fund. We know many states came out with some really big, bold, new funds over the last couple of years, and you showed a map there at the beginning. This was a big moment, right? States were using their American Rescue Plan Act dollars. I'm pretty sure that's getting some Cleveland support, or supporting Cleveland project there. We've seen a lot of really just bold moves from state legislators over the past couple of years, and we're watching them closely. But we don't have a fund yet. We do have a site certification program at the state. Our utilities have readiness programs. So there are different mechanisms in Minnesota, but we have run up against a challenge to get dollars to dedicate to this. And I think that we're not the only state out there that, has had to come, up against this challenge. And so for us, what we're working to do now is, of course, position that this would be a really valuable and important tool in the toolbox from a competitiveness standpoint. But what we have recognized is needed, and I think this is useful for any community, any region, or state, it's really making sure that there is a clear view across your region, across your, geography around what you're trying to build for. What are the outcomes that you're seeking? I think listening to the Cleveland story, it was a very clear direction of, revitalizing and bringing back to productive use these sites in the city, which is so smart. These are the hardest sites, right? These redevelopment sites. As a site selector, we wouldn't touch these because the risk associated with developing them were far beyond what our clients were willing to take on. Again, that speed to market and certainty drive these siting decisions. And so for a city to take on that risk, to remove that risk that the market is not going to do on its own, is such a huge deal. So we think about that here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. How can we bring those sites that have really robust infrastructure already at them back into the fold? And then for the communities that are, our suburban communities that are trying to figure out, what do we want? What is the future for our community, and how do we plan for it? We are aligning around demand. So we have sector focus areas like a lot of parts of the country. And we say these are for the industries that we're really well suited for, and the ones that we're trying to grow, and that where Minnesota broadly has leadership. This is the infrastructure that is needed to be competitive. This is what it's going to take to win these kinds of projects. And then doing a lot of the pre-work right now of just educating of what it takes to win those kinds of projects. It's a lot of work, right? We've got a lot of cities in our metro, a lot of small cities. And so it's a lot of educating. Here's what it takes to be competitive. And actually, here's what you got to do at the comp planning level, right? So as you're doing your land use planning, And in our region, we're doing 2050 comp plan work right now. It's how does your land use plan actually align so that you can assemble some of these larger sites? How are you talking to your townships about orderly annexation? In Minnesota, that is how we, grow our city footprints is through orderly annexation. How do you start to communicate to your townships about the kinds of investment that would need to happen to expand and build out some of these larger sites? So we are deep in the pre-work phase, but I would say the funding mechanisms are very difficult. There are going to be communities in this country that can't get a 200, 300, $400 million readiness fund. And so what do you do alternatively? Well, what are other public-private partnership models to consider? I think that's the space that we're thinking about. And then certainly as we talk about the utility infrastructure, how are you designing regulation and policy in your state to support new infrastructure investment? So in Minnesota, I'll bring in data centers. We have an incredible project, I think a true model for data center development in a Google data center that's coming to Pine Island in Minnesota here, where Google's not only going to be paying for all of the infrastructure to support their energy needs, but that's going to be 100% renewable energy. And this is advancing our state goals towards our mandate for 2040, hitting a carbon-free power generation here in the state, or power utilization for our investor-owned utilities. So we are leveraging these larger investments through data centers to advance our clean energy strategies. This is going to help us to build out a bigger and broader clean energy generation availability in the state of Minnesota that's going to help us to build out more sites for other kinds of users to access that clean energy.
Thank you again, Amanda. Jake, I want to bring you back in here, hear your take on what you're hearing from Amanda and Rick, what you've been hearing, how this aligns with the work you're doing with AIZs. And then, because there are quite a few questions, we're going to then roll into them after you, Jake.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I think the cool thing about this conversation is, I think we're all echoing really similar themes. I think there's both, like from Rick and Amanda, I'm hearing that there's a set of tools that is proven in many ways as a model for site readiness, but that needs to be updated for this current moment, where there may be elements of the toolkit. Power access came up a lot, for instance, that like in this data center boom and broader kind of load growth era, that needs to be maybe further up in the list, or we need to think more innovatively about how we're going to finance that infrastructure build out. Similarly, Amanda talked about the constraints that state and local budgets face in the current sort of macro environment. We're going to have to get more creative about the ways that we put money into site readiness. Not every community can set aside a huge chunk of funding that's flexible and that can do all of these things. And so I think there's an opportunity over the next year or two for all of us to be, identifying these sets of activities, putting a renewed spotlight on them, and then thinking about a new set of policy mechanisms or tools that can break through some of those barriers that are kind of rising to the top now that were maybe not as big of constraints 5 or 10 years ago.
It's one of those moments where you think, well, maybe I should have extended this webinar by 30 minutes, but we're not doing that. So, Rick, clarifying question for you that I want to combine with another question to the panel. Are you referring to, this isn't me talking, this is somebody else. Are you referring to remediation jobs, new industry jobs, or both? And I'd also want to add, are you coordinating with, say, regional economic development organization or your city's economic development organization, thinking GCP in the city there, on key and priority sectors when you're looking at investments?
Yeah, 100%. We are talking about remediation jobs. We are talking about construction and rehab jobs. But really, we are talking about permanent FTEs for new businesses. So what we have learned over the last 30 years, I think, in Cleveland is that it's great to build and it's great to have construction jobs for new projects. But if we are not creating long-term sustaining jobs for our residents, then we are missing out on this massive amount of opportunity. So and we know that good family sustaining jobs come with certain industrial sectors. So, as we target those jobs, I think about a site that says, I've got 10 acres. If I can demolish the buildings that are there, if I can remediate the contamination, if we can build a new facility, hopefully we're bringing in a food manufacturer that's going to produce 150 jobs. And that's the job number that I'm trying to get at. Because there is rampant unemployment in Cleveland, and we know that that's a barrier for economic mobility. The second part of the question is, yes, absolutely. We communicate with Team NEO, who is our Northeast Ohio EDO, and Jobs Ohio, which is the state's economic development program, and almost on a daily basis. GCP, the city, the county, all of these other public sector partners very regularly to work on these type of attraction efforts.
Thank you. For you, Amanda, when Minnesota loses a competitive project today, is the primary issue land readiness, power availability, permitting timeliness, or coordination? And what is the most actionable state level fix? And feel free to project this outside of Minnesota if that's more comfortable.
Well, I just skimmed the question, so I might be able to actually hit on a couple here. We absolutely lose on ready sites. So, being told things like you had the perfect ecosystem, existing industry, workforce, operating environment, but you didn't have a site that met our timeline. So we looked elsewhere, we cut you, is pretty much the hardest thing to hear as an economic developer. And so that is a reason we have lost, and it is a very compelling reason to get support from state legislators to get site readiness funding. And so we have had those experiences, and that has been an effective approach to getting more folks to understand why this is really important from a competitiveness standpoint. But I would tie in, permitting certainty, permitting timeline into that larger equation with site ready, that ultimately, is going to be part of readiness site is how long is it going to take to get that site permitted and titled. I think the other thing to add here, and maybe I'm jumping to another question, but just the point around tax base growth right now, at least in Minnesota, we're running into some really tight budgets. And so when you can represent this sort of pre-planning, pre-investment in sites is going to make you more competitive for tax-based growth. It's easier, I think, for folks to understand who maybe traditionally don't understand, well, why doesn't the market just deliver this? Why do we need to put public funds into this? Why do we need to do any kind of public intervention? Well, this is the way to get to, filling gaps to achieve that tax base. And you can model that out. You can do fiscal, impact, analyses to show for different kinds of industries, the different kinds of ways that particular type of use on that site is going to achieve different kinds of revenue for the municipality. So I think there, in terms of like how do you get folks there? I think there are different tools you can use to get them there. But certainly when everything else works and there's no dirt to put the site on, is pretty much the hardest thing to have happen and a really compelling reason to get people behind the need for a site readiness approach.
Jake, I want to start with you for this, and then if Rick and Amanda, if you want to add on. So power is central to this model, but utilities and regulators may hesitate to build infrastructure before a customer has committed. What models can enable proactive grid investment for industrial zones while protecting existing customers from paying for speculative or stranded infrastructure?
Yeah, great question. I think this is one of the biggest challenges in the space. As the question points out, typically utilities are reactive to requests for power that enter a queue that they're sort of ticking off one by one. I think part of the AIZ model that I'm hoping to advance is that by designating specific zones and having the state engage, you can actually use the levers at the state, so the state regulators, PUCs, et cetera, to encourage proactive planning around the load growth that you expect to see in particular places, knowing that there is site readiness investment, state recruitment, et cetera, to ensure that manufacturers actually come to those sites. That's the sort of soft answer, the more proactive planning approach. I think there are interesting models that we can look to. Amanda touched a little bit on data centers. There is, I think, an opportunity when you think about large anchor tenants in industrial parks, whether that's a data center or a big manufacturer that's committed, to think about how to ensure that they are paying for power upgrades to serve an entire industrial park, and thinking about this is something that I was planning to touch on my presentation, thinking about not just that one use, but sort of spillover benefits of infrastructure investment that can actually be distributed amongst a broader base of load, which can help manage rates, keep rates low, and increase sort of certainty for utilities as they plan infrastructure build out. There are a variety of other potential financing tools. The last thing I just wanted to mention is that one of the most famous zone examples in at least the energy world is the Texas competitive renewable energy zones that facilitated their build out of wind transmission lines from wind resources in the west part of the state to load centers in the east part of the state. And that was financed through a ratepayer package that folks believe paid back within a couple of years because electricity prices dropped so quickly by getting that wind power online. So there are tools like that, but it's still a very live question that I think we need to sort out sort of place by place.
All right, starting with Rick and then Amanda and then Jake, a final word. If you were actually in a room with these people who are attending your fine talk today, what is one piece of advice that you'd want to leave them with in terms of the next step or getting started or the conversation to have in their area?
You have to take risks. Right now, to be able to advance sites forward, to be thinking about these energy questions, you cannot sit back and wait for solutions to be delivered to you. We have to be forward thinking because the moment will pass us by. And being able to take risks is the only way that you're going to get these projects moving.
I just double down on that. I think that is such a good point, especially for cities, counties who have felt perhaps at the staff level, perhaps you couldn't position this to your councils in a way that you could get them there. Please keep trying, try hard. And lastly, speed to market is by no means going to get longer. That's only going to get shorter. So we all have to be moving faster and more efficiently to be winning these investments.
We'll echo that and only add, think beyond the individual projects. Try to equip yourselves and your states with the tools to capture this wave of electro-industrial investment versus just focusing on chasing the individual investment or the individual company. There's so much that we can do through sort of shared infrastructure, shared tools that go beyond the individual single project.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much, Jake Higdon, Amanda Taylor, Rick Barga, of course, Ali Job, who you heard from, Marco Solomon, who you did not hear from behind the scenes. We'll send a recording and slides and look forward to seeing you the next time RMI's Economic Development Team has a webinar. Bye.